I never thought something like this could happen in a quiet little town like ours. I've been working as a detective here for years, and the worst I usually see are bar fights, or, at most, a theft here and there. But a few months ago, everything started to change. People began to disappear, one by one, without a trace. First, it was a young woman, then a guy who worked at the market, and the following week, an elderly man well known around town. And the worst part was that there seemed to be no apparent connection between them. I remember how the air started to feel heavy, as if something unseen was moving in the shadows, watching every step I took. What unsettled me most was the feeling that I was always one step behind. No matter how much I investigated or asked around, it seemed like everyone was afraid to talk, as if they knew something I didn't. I even started to doubt myself, wondering if I was seeing things where there was nothing. But then I started finding strange clues, symbols scribbled on trees near the places where people were last seen, and some burned candles with bits of wax scattered on the ground. That night, I decided I had to understand what was going on. After finding those symbols a second time, I decided to visit the town library to see if I could find anything similar. And there it was, in an old book nearly falling apart, an identical symbol to the one I'd seen carved into the trees. According to the book, the drawing was associated with a type of ancient ritual involving human sacrifice. At that moment, I felt a strange chill, as if I were being watched. I've never been one to believe in cults or magic, but something told me this was different, that I was dealing with something far more sinister than I could imagine. Yet, despite that discomfort, I kept investigating, knowing that the chances of finding anyone else alive depended on me. That same night, I went home, but the weight of that investigation seemed to come in with me. I felt a kind of pressure in my chest, as if the air inside my house had grown denser. It was almost 2 a.m. when I heard a strange sound coming from outside, like a whisper, but it seemed to echo from all directions at once. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the porch. Outside, the night looked darker than usual, and on the lawn, a few yards from the door, I saw a figure standing, covered by a black hood, just staring at me. I couldn't see their face, but I knew they were somehow connected to the disappearances. My instinct was to go straight toward them, but something held me back. I had never been one to hesitate, but that figure standing there, motionless, seemed to carry a kind of threat I couldn't explain. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to decide what to do, when suddenly they turned and began to walk slowly into the woods. Without a second thought, I grabbed my gun, threw on a coat over my pajamas, and followed. The silence was almost deafening, and every step I took made the ground creak as if it wanted to give me away. As I ventured deeper into the forest, I noticed a series of marks on the trees, forming a kind of path that led to a deeper point where my flashlight's beam seemed to fade into the darkness. After walking for a few minutes, I arrived at a clearing surrounded by tall trees, and right in the center, there was a circle made of stones with more of those burned candles I'd seen before. On the ground, there were remnants of something I couldn't immediately identify, but it smelled foul, like rotting meat. A wave of terror swept over me when I realized some of the stones had names carved into them, the names of the missing people. It was as if each stone represented a kind of offering. I stood there, frozen, my flashlight trembling in my hand, trying to process it all. While trying to pull myself together, I heard footsteps around me, as if several people were closing in on me. My flashlight began to flicker, and for a second, I was completely in the dark. When the light came back, I saw I was no longer alone. Several hooded figures appeared among the trees, positioning themselves around the stone circle without making a single sound. They just stood there, watching me. I wanted to run, but I knew that if I did, they could very well capture me. It felt like a nightmare where you can't move. The feeling of helplessness overtook me, and for the first time in my career, I felt real fear. A paralyzing fear that almost made me drop the flashlight. Then, one of the figures stepped forward, carrying something in their hands. When I shone the light on it, I saw it was an amulet made of bones and pieces of old fabric, with that same symbol drawn on it. They held the object out toward me, as if they wanted me to take it. I felt immediate repulsion, but at the same time, a strange sense of attraction. Something in my mind seemed to tell me that if I took it, I would understand what was happening. But at what cost? While I battled internally, they began to murmur in a language I didn't recognize, and the sound seemed to come from all directions, filling the air with a heavy vibration. It was as if time had stopped, and I was trapped there, surrounded by something far beyond my understanding. I felt my knees weaken, but I forced myself to stand, trying to maintain the slightest bit of control. I couldn't show fear, though my heart was pounding so hard I thought they might hear it. I started to back away slowly, still keeping the flashlight pointed at them, but then I heard a voice. It was low and drawn out, calling my name. That voice hit me like a blow, because no one there should have known who I was. I looked around, trying to find where the sound was coming from, but everyone stood still, their faces hidden by their hoods. Calling my name again, the voice seemed to come from within my own mind, echoing in a strange, distorted way. In that moment, I felt a presence so strong, almost suffocating, and I was certain that something or someone was messing with me in a way that wasn't normal. Desperate, I took a step back, and that's when I tripped over one of the stones, falling hard onto the ground. The flashlight slipped from my hand and went out on impact. I lay there in the dark, trying to control my breathing, smelling the earth mixed with that stench that had already permeated the place. Feeling around, I managed to find the flashlight and turn it on again, but when I lifted my face, everyone had disappeared. The candles were out, and the stone circle looked old, abandoned, as if nothing had happened there. I got up quickly, my whole body trembling, and ran out of that clearing as if my life depended on it. And maybe it did. When I finally got home, I locked myself in the bathroom and stared at my reflection in the mirror. I looked like a ghost, pale, eyes wide, sweat dripping down my face. I tried to convince myself it had all been an illusion, maybe the exhaustion of the investigation playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that what I saw and heard that night was real. Something was acting in the shadows of this town, and I was in the middle of it all. Even with all the fear, I knew I couldn't just ignore it. Something kept pulling me back to that mystery, as if I'd been marked somehow. The next morning, I tried to report what I'd found to my superiors, but I could tell from their expressions they didn't believe a word of it. I was the only one who had seen any of it, and talking about symbols, hooded figures, and voices didn't help my credibility. So, I decided to keep what I knew to myself, at least until I had more concrete evidence. But in the days that followed, I started noticing that some people looked at me strangely on the street, as if they knew I knew too much. The town, once calm and predictable, seemed to have changed. At every corner, I felt like I was being watched. After that night, the feeling of being watched intensified to a point I could no longer control. Even in the rare moments when I tried to rest, it was as if those figures were at the foot of my bed, staring at me in the dark. The voice that used to come in the dead of night now seemed to live inside my head, repeating my name over and over, like a haunting that refused to leave. I spent days locked inside my house, trying to ignore it, but the walls seemed to close in around me. My mind, once so clear and logical, began to give way under the weight of something I couldn't understand. I could barely think, and the sounds, symbols, and shadows blended even into the mirrors, into the cracks of my own home. Today, I realize this is my last moment of clarity. I feel as though I'm gradually losing control, my mind being consumed by something I brought back with me from that clearing. I see them everywhere now. Even as I write this, I feel them behind me, waiting for the moment to drag me to the same place that took everyone else. Maybe no one will read this. Maybe it's already too late. But I had to leave this account, because I know that when the sun rises, I won't be the same. All that was left to me was fear. And now, even that seems to have turned into something darker, more final. This is my last breath of sanity before they take me for good. It's hard for me to talk about the case that nearly took my life, and honestly, still keeps me up at night. To tell you the truth, I've never experienced anything like it in my career. The string of ritualistic homicides came to us on a rainy night, and from the first moment, you could feel it wasn't a normal case. The victims, all brutally mutilated, had these strange symbols surrounding their bodies, something between occultism and macabre art. The entire precinct was shaken. It was a long night, with people exchanging heavy glances, but I tried to stay focused on the job. Little did I know, from that moment on, my life would never be the same. The first detective to work the details of the case died in a way everyone thought was odd, but no one questioned it too much. Car accident. It's the kind of thing that happens, right? But things started spiraling out of control when, a few days later, a second detective who had performed the autopsies on the victims had a sudden heart attack. That started to weigh on the team, and there was already talk that this case was cursed. I've always been a skeptic, so I brushed off the gossip and focused on the investigation. Sam, my partner, was the only one who seemed to handle it well, always cracking a joke or laughing it off. It was good to have him around, like an older brother holding it together. I never imagined how wrong I was about everything. It didn't take long for the situation at the precinct to become unbearable. Another officer involved in the case was found dead, this time at his own home, apparently after a domestic accident. It was the third death, and I was beginning to feel the weight this was placing on the team. The case was bizarre enough on its own, but coupled with these deaths, the atmosphere at the precinct became claustrophobic. I could see the exhaustion and fear on everyone's faces, like we were all carrying a ticking time bomb. I tried to stay calm and focus on the evidence, but it was impossible not to feel like something sinister was closing in on us. Sam, on the other hand, seemed unfazed. He kept handling the case like it was just another day at the office. I even admired his way of staying calm, or maybe ignoring what was happening. On one hand, having someone like that helped balance the mood, but deep down, I also felt alone in that sea of tension. The way he always said, "Nothing a good detective can't solve," started to sound almost ironic, but I ignored it. After all, Sam had always been like that, steady, focused, never giving in to fear. And that's why I never realized how dangerously blind I was. As the days went by, something really started to bother me. Aside from the homicides and mysterious deaths of my colleagues, strange patterns began to show up in the case files. Documents disappeared. Reports came back with missing pages. Little things most people wouldn't notice, but I knew something was wrong. I found myself going over the material from the beginning, almost obsessively trying to find some link that would explain what was happening, but everything seemed to lead nowhere. It felt like the case was slipping through my fingers, as if there was something, or someone, operating in the shadows. What I never expected was that it would be so close. At the end of one shift, Sam came up to me and suggested we grab a beer to unwind. He'd always been the take your mind off things type, something I usually thought helped. But this time, it was different. That night, Sam seemed quieter, less easygoing than usual, as if something was bothering him too. He insisted I was overreacting, that I needed to relax and stop taking the work so seriously. I felt torn, but I tried to follow his advice. After all, Sam was my trusted partner, the guy who was there with me through everything. After that night, I started feeling a kind of discomfort around Sam that I couldn't explain. It was subtle, like a barely perceptible change in his demeanor, but it left me uneasy. Even so, it never crossed my mind to distrust him. It was just strange. A week later, I was reviewing some old reports when I noticed a note in one of the first documents I'd missed. A symbol, just like the ones found near the bodies, discreetly drawn in the corner of the page. At first, I thought it might be a printing mark or an error, but it was identical to the symbols at the crime scenes. A chill went down my spine, but I took a deep breath and kept analyzing the files. As I sifted through the papers, I stumbled upon a folder containing records on Sam himself, something that should never have been there. It looked like some kind of record he was keeping on each detective's progress on the case. Names, dates, and deaths. When I saw it, my heart nearly stopped. There was a list of the names of colleagues who had died in recent months, all marked with dates and notes beside them. My mind refused to accept what I was seeing. It was as if someone was tracking every move, every detail, almost like it was some kind of sick countdown. The only question in my mind was, why? I didn't want to believe it, but the list was there, real and meticulously organized. Every dead detective's name, each note, even the causes of death were listed. I tried to convince myself it meant nothing, but my instincts said otherwise. Then, almost accidentally, I dropped the page on the floor and noticed another note on the back. It was the name of another detective, who, as far as I knew, had been taken off the case after the second incident. I remembered what people said. He'd requested a transfer for personal reasons and was never heard from again. That made me panic. It was as if someone was deciding who stayed and who would be replaced. I rushed out of the office, my mind spinning. I needed some air. Without knowing where to go, I found myself outside the bar where Sam went every night. From a distance, I saw him sitting at a table in the back, alone, with a vacant look. He was holding a photo, and as I got closer, I saw it was a picture of one of the victims, but he had no idea I was watching. It felt like I didn't recognize this man anymore. I stood frozen, hidden in the shadow at the entrance, trying to process what I was seeing. Sam, my partner, the one I trusted completely, was there, holding a photo of a victim like it was something personal, intimate. He ran his finger over the person's face in the photo, in a way that was almost ritualistic. In that moment, things started to click, but I still fought against the idea, refusing to accept the obvious. I stayed there, watching, and saw him pull a small knife from his pocket, its blade catching the bar's light. He made a small cut on his finger, letting the blood drip onto the photo, murmuring something I couldn't make out. My stomach turned, and I realized I needed to leave before he noticed me. Back in my car, my mind was racing. All the puzzle pieces seemed to fit in an instant. The detective's deaths, the symbols in the files, Sam's oddly relaxed demeanor. How had I missed it all? It was like he'd done everything right in front of me, and I'd been blind enough to trust him, to think it was just another case. And now, sitting alone in my car, reality hit. I knew I couldn't confront Sam directly, but I needed to get out before I became the next name on his twisted list. That night, I barely slept. I felt like I was being watched, as if Sam knew I'd found out. Every noise in the house made me jump, and all I could think was that I had to find a safe way out, a way to expose everything without getting caught. The next day, I acted as if nothing had happened, but my body was on high alert. I went to the precinct, picked up my gun, and gathered some files that could serve as proof, planning how I'd hand it over without raising suspicion. Every minute around Sam was a test of nerves, trying to keep calm while he looked at me with that same smile, as if nothing had changed. When the end of the shift came, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I left quietly, but before I could reach my car, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was him. Sam looked at me with his usual casual expression and said he wanted to talk. My heart nearly leapt out of my chest. He suggested a walk, saying we needed to resolve some things about the case. I tried to make an excuse, but he insisted. In that moment, I knew he was aware that I was onto him. Each step beside him felt like a test of courage. Sam spoke casually about the case, as if we were discussing something trivial. But my brain was on high alert, analyzing every word, every gesture. He mentioned the weight the case was placing on the team and how sometimes sacrifices are necessary to keep things in order. Those words froze me. Was he hinting at something? Or was it just my panicked mind reading too much into it? The sense of danger was overwhelming, and I knew I needed to get away fast. I forced myself to agree with him, pretending to understand his viewpoint, but I had my hand ready to draw my gun at the slightest suspicious movement. After what felt like an eternity, he finally stopped walking and looked me in the eye, as if he were trying to read my soul. His expression had changed. Sam no longer looked like the friend I knew. There was something cold, almost empty in his gaze. He put his hand in his pocket, and for a second, I thought he was going for his knife again. But he just smiled and said he trusted me to make the right decisions from now on, as if it were some kind of final test. I could only nod, swallowing my panic and pretending I was on board. As he walked away, I knew that was my only warning. Either I escaped, or I'd be the next victim on his list. After that encounter, I realized the only way out was to confront him once and for all. The idea of running didn't feel like enough. I knew that as long as Sam was out there, no one was safe, and I'd live with that fear. After that discovery, the atmosphere among the team changed drastically. Each of us felt the pressure and the uncomfortable sensation of being watched. It was impossible to ignore the fact that somehow the killer knew exactly who we were and where we were. I began to wonder how many times he might have passed by us without us realizing. Instinctively, the team became more cautious, avoiding predictable routines and doubling down on personal security. But for me, the obsession with catching this killer only intensified. We felt that he was one step ahead, but that clue, that provocation, meant he was also vulnerable, that he could make a mistake. A few days later, the van was spotted again, this time in the neighborhood where one of the potential next victims lived. We decided to set up a discreet perimeter, but only a few officers were informed about the operation. Only the most experienced ones, those who had dealt with this type of case before, were aware of our actions that night. A few colleagues and I stayed on standby to intercept him if he tried to attack. The hours dragged on that night. Every sound in the street seemed to heighten the tension in the air. Finally, near midnight, we saw a hooded figure exit the van and walk toward the victim's building. We moved quickly, trying to catch him by surprise. But as we got closer, he seemed to sense our presence. He turned swiftly, and for a moment, I caught a cold glimmer in his eyes before he vanished into the shadows, leaving behind only a trail of footprints and, on the ground, a message written in chalk: "You cannot prevent the judgment." After that confrontation, it became clear that the killer was one step ahead, watching every move of our team. The message on the ground was a direct warning, an indication that he knew of our plans, no matter how secretive they were. With the tension escalating, we were forced to be extra careful and reevaluate our tactics, but that rattled the team. Some of the younger officers began to pull away, claiming illness or requesting transfers, while the veterans, including myself, couldn't afford to retreat. There was a stubbornness, a need to catch this killer that kept us steady, but we knew he was somehow still watching us. The following days were marked by a strange silence, like the calm before a storm. There were no new murders or suspicious movements. The black van seemed to have vanished from the city, and the leads began to cool. On one hand, this gave us a false sense of security, but on the other, it heightened everyone's anxiety. At any moment, he could reappear. Then, a week later, a letter arrived at the precinct. It was addressed directly to me. Inside the envelope, I found a single sheet with a phrase written in red ink: "The final judgment is approaching." It was a clear challenge, and for the first time, I felt we were dealing not just with a serial killer, but with someone who viewed this as a personal mission, as if he himself were the embodiment of the justice that no one else dared to impose. The letter changed everything. Knowing that he had chosen me, that he knew who I was, brought a different kind of fear. I had always dealt with criminals, but never one who saw me so directly, as if I were an essential part of what he was doing. After the letter, I began receiving anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night. They were always silent, but I could hear breathing on the other end. 1, 2, 3 nights in a row. Gradually, the weight of the case began to invade my personal life, and fear mingled with exhaustion. I was forced to change my routine, avoid places I used to go, take precautions I hadn't since the beginning of my career. He wanted me to know he was there, everywhere, at any moment. Then, one of those nights, I received one last call. This time, he spoke. His voice was low, almost a whisper, and he simply said, "The time has come." In that moment, I knew he was about to act, but I didn't know where or against whom. I immediately called the team, and we decided to sweep all locations where the next potential victims might be. I spent the following hours combing through dark streets and old buildings, with anxiety building with each minute. When the sun began to rise, without any sign of the killer or new victims, I felt a temporary relief, but I knew it was only the beginning of something even greater. The next day, while we were still trying to track any suspicious movements, we received news that froze the precinct. One of our colleagues, a veteran who was on the list of a few officers involved in the perimeter, had been found dead in his own home. The scene was brutal, just like in the other crime scenes, but with one detail that left everyone in shock. Next to the body, there was a photo of the entire investigation team, with the faces of those involved crossed out in red, except for mine. It was a clear message. I was next. The death of my colleague brought an urgency we had never felt before, as if we were caught in an endless nightmare. This was no longer a hunt. It was a mutual chase, and he was getting closer. That night, I decided not to go home. I stayed at the precinct, reviewing every detail of the case, every lead and report, hoping to find something that could anticipate his next move. As I looked over the documents, I began to notice something I hadn't before. Each victim had an indirect connection to the team investigating the case, a detail, an unresolved crime, an archived complaint. It was as if the killer were purifying us too, one by one, punishing us for every mistake and injustice we had committed or allowed. The realization came with overwhelming fear. He wasn't just after criminals. He was after everyone who, in some way, was part of this broken system. With that discovery, it was clear he wouldn't stop until he had completed his judgment with all of us. I informed the precinct chief, and extra security was arranged. But deep down, we all knew he would find a way to bypass any barriers we tried to put up. The next night, I received a new letter, delivered directly to my desk at the precinct, despite all the cameras and restricted access. It was a short note with a clear message. We meet where it all began. Come alone at midnight, or another person will be judged. That threw me off. I spent hours trying to understand what he meant by where it all began, until I remembered the first crime scene where the whole case had started. With a mix of determination and fear, I knew I had to go there without telling anyone. I arrived at the abandoned building exactly at midnight. The place was enveloped in silence, a heavy stillness that seemed suffocating. I walked through the dark corridors, my flashlight illuminating the remnants of the first crime scene, the traces of an investigation left behind. Then in the shadows, I saw a figure standing, hooded, waiting for me. He made no move to flee. He just stood there, as if he had planned every second of that encounter. As I approached, he pulled back his hood, revealing a face I would have never imagined. It was someone I thought I knew, someone who was part of the system I defended, but who had succumbed to a distorted vision of justice. He looked at me with an empty gaze, devoid of anger, only unwavering certainty, and said, "I am the judgment you ignored." My heart raced. The revelation of that face caught me off guard, and a wave of confusion washed over me. It was Raphael, the young detective I had considered my partner. Someone who seemed so dedicated to justice now revealed himself to be the killer who had been after me all along. Disbelief filled me as I tried to process the truth. He was responsible for all those deaths. You can't be," I stammered, my mind spinning. He merely smiled, a grin that held no innocence but a twisted satisfaction, as if he were finally freeing himself from a burden. "You never realized, Hector," he said, his voice calm and almost melodic. "I always knew. Justice wasn't what it seemed. Each of them deserved what happened, and you were too busy trying to follow the rules to see the truth." With every word, a new layer of horror unfolded. Raphael wasn't merely presenting himself as a vigilante. He believed in his own mission of purification. The blood of the victims didn't seem to bother him. It was a symbol of his triumph. He continued, "The city was infested with worms, and I am here to eliminate each one of them. You should thank me for opening your eyes." That moment of revelation was devastating, and I knew I needed to act quickly before he decided I was also a target in his insane crusade. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I realized I needed to buy time. Raphael was in a position of control, and any wrong move could cost innocent lives. "Raphael, you can stop this. You don't have to continue. We can solve this together. Justice isn't made this way." I tried to reason with him, but the expression on his face showed that he was beyond any logical argument. He merely shook his head slowly, as if I were a disobedient child, and began to approach, the glimmer in his eyes pure conviction. "You don't understand, Hector. This is true justice. I am the judge, the jury, and the executioner, and you have the chance to join me, or become one of the next victims." With the team still on alert, I needed to act fast. In a sudden movement, I pulled my weapon, aiming it at him. "Raphael, stay where you are. Don't force me to do this." But he only laughed, a laugh that sounded more like scorn than a sign of fear. "You think you can stop me? I know every shadow of this city. I am the shadow you don't see, the true face of justice that has always been by your side." And then, before I could react, he made a sudden move, darting toward the exit, as if slipping away to the freedom he had always sought. In that moment, with my heart racing and my mind alert, I signaled to the team, shouting for them to enter. The sound of quick footsteps echoed behind me, and a part of me knew I couldn't let Raphael escape. The scene unfolded in slow motion as we ran through the building, and the truth was clear. I not only needed to stop him, I needed to confront what he had become, a monster hiding behind the mask of justice. And with that, the final confrontation was about to begin. Adrenaline surged through my body as the team split up, seeking to surround all exits. Raphael was agile, but I knew those corridors and the shadows they hid. He might be a skilled detective, but he had now become a desperate criminal, and his haste to escape could be his greatest weakness. "Raphael!" I shouted, trying to distract him, forcing him to reveal his location. "This isn't you. You don't have to do this." The response was tense silence, followed by distant laughter echoing through the corridors. He was playing, like a cat with a mouse, and that only fueled my determination. Finally, I caught sight of a shadow moving in one of the adjacent corridors. Without a second thought, I dashed in that direction. When I reached the end of the corridor, I found Raphael standing, waiting, a look of satisfaction on his face. He was cornered, yet still appeared confident. "You can't stop me, Hector. I am the answer to the corruption you've always ignored." His voice echoed with a fervor that rang out like a condemnation. "You can arrest me, but it won't change the truth. Justice is blind, and I am the only one who sees." But at that moment, with the team finally surrounding him, a decision had to be made. I couldn't let him escape again. With a firm movement, I raised my weapon once more. "Raphael, don't do this. Surrender, and we can put an end to this." He hesitated for a moment, the glimmer in his eyes shifting slightly, as if weighing his options. But the arrogant laugh quickly returned, and he scoffed. "Do you really think you can arrest me? I am more than a mere killer. I am the change this city needs." And with a swift motion, he spun around and shot down the corridor, seeking an exit. But I couldn't let that happen. Time seemed to stop as I launched myself after him, each step echoing in my mind. With the team on my heels, we knew this was our last chance to stop him. When I reached the end of the corridor, I found Raphael trying to escape through a side door. He was almost there, nearly free from us. With adrenaline pumping, the decision was instantaneous. I fired my weapon, but not to injure. My goal was to shoot the door's lock, the sound of impact echoing through the structure. The door slammed shut with a bang, and Raphael's expression shifted from triumph to despair. He turned to me, and for a brief moment, I saw the man he used to be instead of the monster he had become. "You don't understand, Hector. You are part of the problem." But it was too late. With the team's help, we finally cornered him, and with a firm order, he was subdued. What could have been a fatal final confrontation turned into a resolution that brought not only relief, but also a weight of responsibility onto my shoulders. I never thought I would reach this point in my career. When I decided to become a police officer in my early 20s, everything seemed simple. There was good, there was evil, and we needed to do our part to keep them both in their rightful places. I came from a modest family with few resources, and my mother took pride in having a detective son in Mexico City. But the city isn't easy. Over the years, I've seen things that kept me awake at night, things that made me question the meaning of my work. Yet I never stopped believing in what I did. At least, not until that year. The series of brutal crimes that began to make headlines shook everyone's heads. It was one thing to face criminals on a daily basis. It was another to find mutilated bodies, people who seemed to have suffered in unimaginable ways before finally dying. The victims were not just anyone. They were known figures with criminal histories, individuals who had escaped the law and blended into the city, living as if they hadn't done anything. Traffickers, gang leaders, people with blood on their hands, whom justice had never managed to catch. The first body found was that of a businessman with a history of fraud and money laundering. He was discovered in a secluded street, his face so disfigured that it barely resembled a human, fingers severed and legs broken at angles that seemed impossible. When the second body was found, an ex-cop involved in trafficking, everyone began to realize that it was no coincidence. Someone was hunting these people one by one. At that time, I was practically living at the precinct. It was during this period that Rafael Torres became a detective. He was a rookie, but had an impressive discipline for a guy his age. Quiet, always wearing a rosary around his neck. Rafael had a serene face and maintained an almost unshakable demeanor at crime scenes, something that soon drew attention. He didn't talk much about his personal life, but he showed a deep interest in every detail of the cases, asking questions and taking notes with almost obsessive precision. Despite his lack of experience, Rafael brought detailed information about each victim, always arriving with more data than I expected. He seemed to know the histories of the people even before the reports arrived, and sometimes he mentioned details about the crimes that I hadn't even noticed at first. On several occasions, he asked specific questions about the marks on the bodies or what might have happened before death. He observed everything closely, analyzing each scene with more attention than any rookie I had ever known. As time went on, the list of victims only grew, and the details of the murders became increasingly brutal. Each body bore different marks, but there was a pattern in the way the wounds were inflicted, as if they were carefully calculated to provoke maximum pain before the end. The victims were always found in isolated places, but still within the city, and what truly caught attention was that all of them had criminal backgrounds. Traffickers, corrupt ex-cops, leaders of small criminal groups. None of them were exactly innocent, but the level of violence applied in each case surpassed anything I had ever seen. During one of these investigations, while observing the body of one of the victims, I noticed Rafael studying the wounds with unusual attention. He scanned the cuts, examining every detail as if searching for something specific. Without saying a word, he crouched down and traced his fingers on the ground near the body, where there was a stain that looked like dried blood. When I asked if he had found anything, he just looked at me and shook his head, but took a few seconds to pull away. After that, I began to notice that he always did this, silently examining the area around the victims, as if he knew where to look. As we delved deeper, we began to notice some patterns in the crimes that could lead us to the perpetrator. In every scene, the bodies were left in areas where the victims had some previous connection, former trafficking points, lots they had used for money laundering, or places where prior crimes had occurred. This choice of locations seemed deliberate, as if the killer wanted the victims to be found where they had caused pain and suffering. We raised this hypothesis with the team, and in a way, it gave us a map of the potential operational radius of the criminal. Slowly, we managed to identify witnesses who had seen strange movements on the nights of the murders. Some residents reported seeing a man in dark clothing, always wearing a hood, lurking in the nearby areas shortly before the bodies were found. One witness even mentioned seeing a black van parked near the site of the third murder. With these reports, we began to look for security camera footage in the mentioned areas, hoping to get some visual lead on the suspect. In one of these recordings, we caught a quick glimpse of the vehicle, but the license plate was obscured. Even so, it was a breakthrough. For the first time, we had something concrete to track. With this new information, we decided to compile a list of potential next victims. We started mapping out individuals known to have recently evaded justice. The goal was to try to predict where the killer might strike next. It was exhausting work, but gradually we managed to narrow the list down to a few names that fit the profile of previous victims. We set up a discreet operation to monitor these people, keeping security cameras and patrols nearby, hoping to catch the killer in the act. The city was on alert, and for the first time, we felt like we were one step ahead of him. Then one night, we received a call informing us that one of the names on the list had been found dead, despite all the monitoring. The body was in an abandoned building, and, as in previous cases, the marks and brutality were there. However, there was something different this time. In one of the rooms of the building, we found a message written on the wall, made with what appeared to be blood. Those who evade justice will face their own judgment. This new element left us even more apprehensive. It was a clear message, a sort of manifesto. This killer was not just a vigilante, but someone who genuinely believed he was fulfilling an almost sacred role, as if he were on a mission to purify the city. After finding the message at the crime scene, we began to delve into the symbolism used by the killer. We analyzed the patterns of the words, the tone of the writing, and even the shapes of the letters, hoping to identify some unique characteristic. It was at this point that the case took an even darker turn. We consulted criminal profiling experts and a forensic psychologist, and the consensus was clear. The killer showed clear signs of psychopathy. The choice of words, the content of the messages, and the brutal precision of the acts suggested someone with a distorted sense of justice, but with no empathy or remorse. He seemed to seek control and a kind of pleasure in inflicting pain, as if each murder were a reaffirmation of his power. Some time later, we received an unexpected lead. A security camera from a small store near one of the crime scenes captured a clearer image of a man exiting a black van. The photo was still distant, but it allowed us to see more details. A partially obscured face and something that looked like a chain hanging around his neck. This was the first real glimpse of the suspect, and it accelerated the pace of the investigation. We distributed the image across all precincts and launched an intensive citywide search. We believed we were close to capturing him, and with that, putting an end to his killing spree. However, deep down, there was a strange feeling in the air, as if he already knew we were on his tail and was watching us closely. With the image in hand, we began to track possible locations where the black van might be hiding. We focused on abandoned warehouses, parking lots in remote neighborhoods, and places known to harbor clandestine activities. It was exhausting days, and with every false lead, the tension mounted. Then one night, we received an anonymous tip about a van matching the description parked behind an old industrial building that had been inactive for years. We set up an operation and approached the site quietly, surrounding the area as special teams went in to check it out. However, when we stormed the building, we found only an empty room, and, in the center, an improvised altar with newspaper clippings about each of the victims. Around the altar were items that belonged to the victims: watches, chains, small personal belongings, as if they were trophies of the killer. On the floor, messages written in red ink detailed the sins of each one. It was a macabre collection that confirmed the level of obsession and planning of the killer. As we inspected further, we found something that froze everyone in the room: a photo of the investigation team, including me and Raphael, marked with the phrase "unwanted observers." The killer knew we were after him, and apparently was challenging us to continue, as if it were a game where he dictated the rules.